Good afternoon. My name is Joe Rogers, and I'm the Director of Public Engagement and Government Affairs with the Center for Educational Equity at Teachers College, Columbia University. I'm here today representing the DemocracyReady NY Coalition, which is convened by the Center for Educational Equity and includes a wide range of education stakeholder groups from all around the state that fall into a few different buckets that I'll talk about momentarily. But we're so pleased that you're able to join us here today and excited to engage in what we know will be a productive and exciting conversation, certainly a timely one, on whether New York students, all New York students, have access to the civic learning opportunities that they need and to which they're entitled by law. And we want to hear from you. I'm going to give you some background information on the constitutional right to civic preparation. You're going to hear from a few stakeholders selected by coalition member organizations, and they're going to tell you a little bit about what the findings from this recent report that the Center for Educational Equity wrote based on a pilot study mean to them as students, as parents, as youth development organization representatives, as teachers, and as school board association representatives. So that's just to give you a sense of where we're headed. After you hear from our featured education stakeholders, we're going to then open up the conversation, and we hope that you will engage and add your thoughts and questions toward guiding the DemocracyReady NY Coalition's work in the coming months and years toward ensuring that all students receive the full range of civic learning opportunities that they need in order to participate in and shape our democracy. So we're going to then transition to our next slide. Okay, I've mentioned this is the Center for Educational Equity again. CEE, as you may know, is a research and policy organization based at Teachers College, Columbia University, that works to ensure that the rights, the educational rights of all students are honored and that students receive the meaningful, high-quality educational opportunities that they need in order to be successful. A little bit more about the DemocracyReady NY Coalition. Again, I mentioned that the stakeholders at the table who are guiding and driving the coalition's work fall into one of three buckets, and those are school funding / educational equity, education advocacy groups, including several statewide organizations. You also have civic educators, and these include both school-based educators. These include education specialists and particularly social studies specialists, as well as nonprofit organizations, many of whom partner with schools to provide civic education or civic learning services and supports. And last but not least, you have good government groups, I'll call them. And those are groups that are trying to ensure that folks, particularly voters, are well informed about the options. They're staying abreast of candidates, political candidates, and ultimately that those who are able in our state go to the polls. But of course, civic participation, civic engagement doesn't stop with voting, and we want to make sure that all civic participants, all members of the New York family or New York community are able to participate in our democracy, whether that's at the local level, the state level, or community level, I should have mentioned, or beyond at the federal level. Some would say globally as well. So just very quickly about the DemocracyReady NY Coalition, what you see on your screen now are the four elements or four components of the coalition's mission. And those are very simply to promote all students' right under the Constitution to be prepared for civic participation. We'll say a little bit more about what the Constitution guarantees in a moment. The coalition is also raising awareness about that right. I'm sure many of you out there are unfamiliar with this specific constitutional guarantee to our children that they be prepared for civic participation. So we want to make sure all New Yorkers are aware of what the Constitution guarantees. We want to strengthen state policy, strengthen the laws, the policy practice, and resources that allow our schools to be effective in serving our children in civic learning, civic teaching and learning. So we're developing policy proposals and recommendations to help guide our state. And then finally, we're mobilizing the expertise of a wide range of stakeholders. And you see, we list students there first because the coalition has made a very strong commitment to ensuring that those New York stakeholders who are most affected, our young people, and ultimately their families as well, are at the table. But we also include, as you can see, educators, researchers, advocates, legal experts, and other key stakeholders. So back to the constitutional context. Some of you are familiar with CFE, or the Campaign for Fiscal Equity versus the State of New York lawsuit. That was a suit that was waged from 1993 to 2006. So it was a 13-year legal battle that was fought with and on behalf of families in New York who realized that their children, and in some cases the children themselves, realized they weren't receiving even the basic opportunities that they needed in order to meet state standards and ultimately to be successful in life. As a result of that momentous lawsuit, which was led by the Center for Educational Equity's executive director, Michael Rebell, at that point, a couple of really important takeaways or achievements were emerged from that case. So those are the two that are most relevant. Certainly, they're both relevant to our conversation, but the one that's most relevant is it declared that the courts, the highest court, the Court of Appeals, declared that young people in New York State, in every school, every part of the state, they have a right to preparation to become productive civic participants. And this certainly isn't an exhaustive list of examples of civic participation, but you can see there that voting and serving on a jury are two of the fundamental roles in our society and in our state that young people must be prepared to fulfill. The other bucket of rights, if you will, pertain to preparation for competitive employment, which essentially means preparation to get a good job, one that allows you to support your family, yourself, and to play an active role in our society that way. So again, preparation for civic participation was one of the key takeaways from that lawsuit. Let's drill down a little bit more. The judges in that case said, and again in the CFE case, said that each school, not just some schools, each school must have the resources that they need in order to ensure all students the opportunity to meet state learning standards toward being prepared to play their civic roles and to get good jobs. More specifically, again, I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you, but you will receive some of these details in follow-up emails over the next week or so. But I just wanted to give you a little more background, a little context for the conversation we're about to engage in together. In the CFE case, the courts also enumerated 7 categories of specific resources that are fundamental, that are foundational in preparing young people to play their civic roles and again, to be able to secure a good job. And those includes, you can read them here, but they include staff, so teachers, principals, and other personnel, a curriculum that's tailored to the needs of students, particularly students who are struggling academically, to make sure they're able to meet state standards and become effective civic participants. Resources for our young people who have disabilities and who are learning English as a new language. Appropriate class sizes, suitable and up-to-date, the judge called them instrumentalities of learning, which is a dense legal phrase, but you can see here that that category includes books, supplies, libraries, and other essentials that schools need to be able to provide to young people. A safe and orderly environment, and ultimately adequate and accessible school buildings. These rights in great detail, in a lot of legalese and policy language, are documented quite well in the Center for Educational Equity's most recent edition of Essential Resources, which you can find at centerforeducationalequity.org. We call it it's a compilation or compendium of educational rights, every subject area, every social support area. And again, I can't stress this enough. It's not just about, right, we need resources, we need funding in order to purchase these opportunities, to afford these specific resources to all young people so that they ultimately are able to participate in and shape our democracy. So the primary text, besides the Constitution, that we want to outline here for you today, again, toward supporting your participation a little later in the conversation, is a recent pilot study that my colleagues and I at the Center for Educational Equity, namely Jessica Wolf, who's our Director of Policy and Research, and I, and in collaboration, of course, with our Executive Director, Michael Rebell, conducted in 6 high schools. Small study. That's why, for those of you who aren't as familiar with research lingo, pilot means sort of an initial effort to test your hypothesis, to see whether the questions you're asking are going to elicit the types of information you're looking for, toward later on maybe expanding the study to include additional subjects or participants to gain additional information on a larger scale. So again, this is a pilot study in which my colleagues and I went into 6 high schools, 3 in New York City, as you can see there, all serving students living with poverty, and then 3 suburban schools, one very well-resourced, high-wealth school, a school with more or less average wealth, and then one of those suburban schools also, like the New York City schools, was serving a high concentration of students living in poverty. In order to gather the data, in order to better understand to what extent young people in these schools, in a small sample of schools, were receiving the specific learning opportunities that you just saw in those 7 categories, we spoke with dozens and dozens of educators. We interviewed them. We visited the schools at least a few times and spoke with principals, teachers, especially social studies teachers and other personnel, to understand to what extent their schools were equipped and supported in order to fulfill this constitutional obligation that all New York students have. So we conducted those interviews. We also looked at public documents and some online data. So I want to highlight very briefly a couple of findings. Again, you're going to receive both an executive summary, sort of a quick snapshot of these findings, not just the ones I'm sharing here today, but other findings as well. And you'll receive the full report, which is 50 pages, I think we're up to right now. We're excited to release that, to share that with you. And if you haven't already selected some summer reading materials, I can tell you, you're going to want to replace whatever you put on your reading list with this report. It's a blockbuster, great beach reading, pool reading, or what have you. So get ready for that. Coming soon to an inbox near you. So let me highlight for you just a couple of these important, as I turn to my slides here, these important findings. So one finding is we found enormous disparities in access to the basic coursework, as well as electives that young people need in many cases in order to become truly civic ready. And I'll pause for a moment there, just one other contextual piece here that's very important. Many of you may know that a few years ago, the New York State Board of Regents and the New York State Education Department submitted to the federal government an Every Student Succeeds Act plan, basically a plan for how the state is going to comply with federal regulations toward meeting the needs of students throughout our state. And in that plan, for the first time, they identified civic readiness as one of the key goals for our state's educational system. So before, we talked a lot about college and career readiness, obviously important, but they added this 3rd C. And that was instrumental, and is really also one of the organizing principles for our work here. The state continues in its official capacity to advance that work, and we're finding opportunities to gain synergy, really to coordinate and collaborate among the various groups, including the DemocracyReady NY Coalition and the state's current Civic Readiness Task Force. So I will tell you that those disparities in access to some of the fundamental courses in high school not only concerned the level of detail that schools were able to cover toward meeting the needs of their students in the core classes, but it included a wide range of major disparities, major gaps in access to civic learning related elective courses. And really, just to really drive home the point, we found in our best resource school in that high wealth district, a school that had 20 electives related to civic education. And in some of the schools that we visited, including most of those in New York City, some of them weren't providing any elective courses, not related to civic learning and civic preparation, not because they didn't care about their students, not because they weren't committed to preparing their young people, but due to resource issues. They did not have the staffing they needed in order to provide a wide range of opportunities to our young people. I also note here that just back on that last finding, the better resource schools were able to provide redundant opportunities, meaning they didn't just have one section of a course. They didn't just have one class. They had multiple courses to make sure that all students were able to access them. Another major finding that you'll read more about in the forthcoming report is disparities in access to experiential learning opportunities. That includes both democratic conversation and debate within the classroom, as well as what some would consider either extracurriculars or field trips. So one of the key, the literature, the existing literature on civic preparation and civic education is very clear on the point that young people need extracurriculars, or what some people would see as extra, such as, just for example, school newspaper, student government, could be a work in the arts, theater, for example, which allows you to examine issues from multiple perspectives, toward becoming civic ready. And we found that particularly the schools serving mostly students living in poverty, they were unable to provide the wide range of experiential hands-on learning opportunities that young people need in order to practice the skills. It's one thing to learn about, it's one thing to study the text, it's another thing to actually to exercise and to practice and develop one's skills. And that can only come, which is true for both children and adults, through actually grappling with things yourself, real world problems, being hands-on. Another important finding here. Jumping along here, none of the students, and so you may find this either really surprising or particularly if you work in schools and perhaps you're a student yourself, may not be surprising, but particularly given how the internet is so pervasive, how it in many ways drives, whether it's through news or through our browsing, what we learn and what we know, what we believe we know, and what sources we consult. None of the study schools, none of these 6 schools in our sample were providing a really comprehensive and coherent media literacy education. So in fact, some of the schools were not providing access to library media specialists or school librarians. Those are required under state law. And yet some students didn't have access to the additional research support, the additional support our young people need to be able to distinguish good, solid, reliable information from unreliable and heavily biased information, to be able to develop the judgment, the discernment to know how to answer questions with good information. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and I think it probably sets us up for the introduction to our amazing panelists for today. And I'm excited here and you see the panelists are gonna start popping in here. Their videos will show up, and this is the cue to appear. Look at that, like magic. Wonderful. All right, so I want to recognize that we have a wide range of key stakeholders here. There are more, but often when people think about education, they think about students, parents, educators, the youth development and nonprofit spaces and school boards. Next time we have a webinar, we'll include additional voices, but right now I'm excited and pleased and honored to introduce Hamza Noor. Hamza is an 11th grader at Chalmont High School in the Capital Region. Welcome, Hamza. Hamza, I should also note, is a member of the DemocracyReady NY Coalition and is part of the Youth Leadership Initiative that we launched at the beginning of this process to enlist young people's leadership and insight and experiences in guiding the coalition toward ultimately guiding the state and recommending to the state some of the changes that may need to be made to fulfill the constitutional obligation. So thank you so much, Hamza, for being with us today. We also have here Leah Ntwala. Leah is a parent who comes to us from Seneca Falls School District. She's up in the northwestern part of the state. Leah, I'm really pleased to share, she's a member of, or represents in many ways, among other hats she wears, she's a rural parent. And so often we have these siloed discussions about education and educational improvement. Sometimes we have an urban conversation, we have the suburban conversation, we have the rural conversation. Rarely do you bring all these different stakeholders together. So thank you so much, Leah, for being with us here today and offering a parent's perspective. We have next Tiffany Allen Hubbard. Tiffany is a social studies teacher. It's critically important to have educators at the table when we're talking about improving education, obviously. She's a social studies teacher at Hillcrest High School, And she is also a site specialist with the United Federation of Teachers, or UFT, Teacher Center. And they have some exciting civic learning related work that they're doing with a small network of social studies educators and others. And we look forward to hearing more about that. Stay tuned. Next, we have Diana Vasquez, and Diana is the statewide coordinator of the Angelo del Toro Puerto Rican Hispanic Youth Leadership Institute. Amazing statewide organization, partners with schools, but largely operates outside of the school context, providing experiential, hands-on learning opportunities that include actual contact and exchange and role modeling with actual legislators in our state capital. So you'll hear a little bit more about what they're doing and why that's important. And certainly, last but not least, we have Jay Warona. Jay, thanks for being with us. Jay is the Deputy Executive Director and General Counsel of the New York State School Boards Association. So it's important we have a management perspective here as well. So thank you so much, Jay. So I'd like to right away switch to, and let's go ahead and what I'm going to do here, I'm going to bring us back to this slide, is I have a set of questions based on the findings from this forthcoming Center for Educational Equity report that are targeted at the specific experiences and expertise of our stakeholder representatives. I'd like to start with Hamza Noor. Hamza, extracurricular activities, for example, working on the school newspaper, on the student council, or in clubs based on students' identities are one way that many students access important civic learning opportunities. However, this study suggests that students who work after school in order to help support themselves and or their families cannot stay after school to participate in any of those clubs or other extracurriculars. What can schools, districts, and or the state do through policy or otherwise to ensure all students the opportunities to participate in these hands-on experiential civic learning opportunities?
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm thankful for the coalition for giving students this opportunity to giving me the opportunity to represent students, because you can't solve a problem without, talking with the people that it affects. So I'm thankful for that. So this question directly relates to me and a lot of other students, and it's an issue that we've currently been working on in my school district. And so I'm an activist and community organizer, and oftentimes I've experienced that the work I do and a lot of the other students like me do interferes with our schoolwork. And without a doubt, the work that I and many other students do outside of school benefits us just as much as school does. And different kinds of extracurricular activities not only teach us like life skills and they build character, but they also strengthen students' resume and show colleges how a student is well-rounded. Along with that, students get many civic learning opportunities because they're doing more than just schoolwork, and they're doing real life things. So the idea that I've presented to my school district and is being discussed by my administration right now as well is that it's providing students with the freedom, time, space, availability to do extracurricular activities in their school schedules during school days. And a period or a small amount of time is designated for students to work on their own project, research, organizing, or whatever they're pursuing at that time. And that can be activism or leadership like me, or a student working on their own business, or working on their own project, a research project, or building a robot for an engineering class. And the possibilities are endless with today. And students can be given credit and recognition by the school for the extracurricular activities that they do, and different forms of projects and organizing different events are great civic learning experiences that should be given credit for. After a quarter or a set amount of time, the students have an adult supervisor that not only supervises but provides guidance and helps the student in whatever way they need. And after a quarter or a set amount of time, the adult meets with the students to see the progress that they have made in their specific projects, and assesses it. And the advisor is able to provide the right resources and the right information or the right guidance, and just nudge them in the right direction to achieve whatever they want to achieve. That includes like availability of resources in schools, or providing new leads to internships, or different ways to get to where their students is trying to get with their project. And this also allows the adults to assess how the student is learning 21st century skills necessary to be successful in today's world. And students students being able to work on their own project that they're passionate about allows them to have real life experiences in high school while also doing schoolwork, which is really important. And that also teaches, from my experience and many other students like me that I've talked to, and I see that teaches a lot of civic learning experiences, and that definitely is a really important part of learning these experiences, actually doing these things. And if the school is able to provide that for you in the school's schedule, that it makes it a lot easier for a lot of students that aren't able to do these things outside of school to be able to participate in them. And this is the idea that I've presented with my school, and they're working on it. And I believe that it will increase the civic learning and preparation of New York State students.
Great. Perfect. Thank you so much, Hamza. It sounds like you're not only talking about how do we achieve equity by, as I believe you said, embedding these hands-on opportunities, clubs and what have you during the school day. You're actually exemplifying civic participation by taking this idea, bringing it to your administrators. And we look forward to seeing how that works out. Perhaps that'll be a model for other schools around the state. And we look forward to sharing that and following your work in general. So thank you for leading us off here, Hamza. Appreciate it. So we have next, again, we have Leah Entwala. Leah is providing a parent perspective today. And a question for you, Leah, is when many people think of parents' roles in education, they focus only on school level activities. Some people think about the PTA, et cetera. And those are really important, right? We can't understate the value of PTAs. And I know some PTAs are involved more broadly at the policy level. So with an eye toward that, how can we ensure that parents at the table, how can they help eliminate disparities in access to some of the civic learning opportunities that we found in our study and that are not available at the school district and state levels? What can parents do to help move the conversation and ultimately move us all toward providing access to all young people to the full range of learning opportunities?
Well, as a parent, I strongly feel that an essential part of my role in my child's education is supplementing whatever it is that they are already learning in school. So using the library to access more information on a topic that my kids are learning already. However, you have to sometimes have the resources to do this, which include money, time, and transportation. And several communities and students and parents do not have this at their fingertips, particularly in rural areas, I think. But I think the best asset that a community always has are the people. And that includes your parents and everything, but at every level in any city or town across the United States, you have local leaders. It doesn't have to be, civic focus doesn't always have to be at a federal level. So how do you access the people who are in your community, who are holding local offices? How do you engage them in the school? The other thing as a parent is I feel like some of these conversations start too late in our child's education. If we want our children to be civically engaged, I think it needs to be a K through 12 effort. It's not just a civic course you take as a 10th grader or 11th grader, or when you register to vote and having had no preparation. So I think the earlier we can make kids aware of even the calendar of voting is something that you can do that doesn't cost any money. So I think it's thinking creatively about the resources you have. And most of the time I think as a parent, we can engage our communities and our students and our children in something that costs nothing but time. So it doesn't cost any time to let kids know and how maybe they would vote on a school levy, and presenting that information and letting them K through 12 have mock trials and ballot boxes in their schools so they get used to the idea of what it means to vote and how the voting cycle's done. When there is a local election that's happening or a primary that's happening, it doesn't have to be federal. You can ask those people to come in and present their ideas to the kids and let the kids vote and ask questions. I think registering to vote is a big thing, and I think students should be leading those at all school events. There should be a table led by students K through 12 at these events that says register to vote, because if your kid is asking you how you participate, if they're seeing that, then not only does it empower you as a child to know what that means, I think the children then can empower their parents in these activities. I think it's also looking at neighboring schools on various levels to say, if we can't go to DC, how do we access our neighboring communities or partnering schools where there is disparity financially, to say, how can we supplement these kids so that they can go, maybe not to DC or something, but to a local historic civic engagement site, or having conversations like with this activity, to be able to engage our students more in these panels and topics. So I think some of it is with parents, and I know as a parent you're exhausted by your kids' school activities and their homework, and all our kids do those things differently. But it's recognizing that your biggest assets are always your people, and how do we engage the people in our community to want to partner and participate with our students, knowing that the more knowledgeable we make them, the better and more readily they'll be ready to serve on our local juries and broadly.
Great, thank you, Leah. Excellent. So I heard a couple of things from you, and you offered so much. I'm trying to capture a few of the key points I heard. You started out talking about transportation and how, particularly in rural communities, it may be difficult to transport young people to and from extracurricular, whether it's learning opportunities, whether it's through clubs or what have you. And I remember that from a study we conducted a number of years ago, that was something that rural principals and teachers told us about, is that can be a major barrier, and that there are costs associated with that. You have to be able to provide adequate transportation beyond that required for participation in the regular school day. But you also said something I think is really important, I just want to underscore, which is about using existing resources, including your people being your most important resources. So while there may be things such as transportation in a rural community, or staffing, or other resources in those 7 categories that we discussed earlier, that you may need more of or may need different kinds of in order to prepare young people, look at what you do have already and see how you can make the best use of that. And that included, as you said, making sure young people, our students, are involved meaningfully in hosting forums, participating in these kind of conversations about how do we better strengthen our schools toward ensuring all young people these kinds of opportunities. So thank you again, Leah, for sharing your perspective as a parent. I'd like to turn now to Tiffany Allen Hubbard. Again, Tiffany is a social studies teacher at Hillcrest High School in New York City, and she's also a site representative or a site coordinator with the UFT, with the United Federation of Teachers Teacher Center. So she actually teaches and she supports other educators in her school and beyond in serving their students well. So Tiffany, if I may ask you, the study findings suggest that some high schools have the resources to hire a sufficient number of teachers to provide a wide range of course offerings across the curriculum that contribute to civic readiness, including, for example, as I mentioned earlier, social studies electives, and current issues, and advanced coursework related to civic issues, while others offer no or very little more than the core classes, the core courses required to graduate. Does this matter? And if so, how? And then what can we do from a policy perspective, from your perspective, as an educator, to correct some of those disparities, to make sure all students have access to a rich and wide range of coursework, if it's important?
So, good afternoon, everyone. This has really been interesting meeting of the minds so far. I'm really noticing that despite the disparities, because there are so many disparities that exist between different schools and different communities, I also noticed that there is a similar or maybe even the same desire to be civically prepared and to have students civically prepared. So I've been teaching so far for 19 years. I've taught in quite a few different high schools. Right now I'm at Hillcrest High School in Queens, which is a large and pretty diverse school. And we have so many opportunities for students to engage civically through things like our theater program and our public service program, connection to NYPD and FDNY Explorer programs, mock trial, Model UN, so on and so forth. I really want to speak today from the perspective or from the understanding of those schools that don't have that, which are the rest of the schools that I've taught in. It is very difficult for schools, especially when they're operating in a small capacity. You know, there was this thing that happened in around the 90s, 2000s, where like a lot of the big schools that had a lot of teachers and a lot of students and the ability to kind of provide these kinds of experiences have been made into smaller schools where you may have 20 teachers, you know, with a student body of about 500 kids or 600 kids. And in that way, those kids don't have the same access to different kinds of coursework and different types of extracurricular activities. And I think it definitely matters. So even within the city, or even if we're looking at the state in general, this is a major, major issue. So what are the things that we can do is the question. One of the things that we need to do is make sure that schools have available for at least extracurricular activities, even if they can't program within their school day, to provide a lot of support. Some of these schools, as we talked about, were like maybe the smaller schools, and those small schools can have partnerships where each school might run a different program, or, you know, and then students can visit that program from other schools. In New York City, we typically have high schools that have a campus with maybe 4 or 5 high schools that exist in the same building. So this would be a good opportunity to have students cross-register for programs, but also cross-register for AP courses and things like that that haven't been available to students. And I think that is important. A couple of things that really caught my attention was these ideas about students in government, and as Hamza said, students really becoming vocal advocates for themselves. One of the opportunities that we can provide is the idea of like participatory budgeting, where we actually have students involved in determining which of these extracurriculars will be supported and how we will support them. So students actually determining what should happen in their school. Also, I talked a little bit before about just having functioning student governments. A lot of schools don't have those. Democratically elected student governments, where students like Hamza and other students can really have a grassroots kind of emphasis and talk to their classmates and kind of increase awareness. Another thing that I brought up, and I think is important, is the idea that students need to be able to see education from multiple perspectives. So even if we had some sort of program where students could, if they're participating in student government, that those student governments can visit other schools to see what is on the agenda for other schools and how they operate. I think it's important to kind of have that, that kind of energy where schools are sharing the great things that they do, and students are well aware of what's going on in their schools and in other schools as well.
Great. Thank you, Tiffany. I appreciate it. A couple of things. Well, first, let me say here, because I know some of our members of the public, some of our education stakeholders who are with us here today, and it looks like we have around 60 or so, which is a good number. One of the things I was remiss in doing at the beginning of the conversation was to make sure people knew how to use the tools at the bottom of the webinar screen. So those of you, I see some of you are chatting it up in the chat box at the bottom. You should see at the bottom of your screen a little bubble icon with 3 dots. It says chat. That's where you can, one, request help if you need help, tech help. You're new to the platform, this particular tech platform. I should mention that Cassidy Grubbs, Cassidy is our support person for the webinar here today, and she's managing the chat box. So for those of you, thank you. Those of you who have been commenting and responding to some of the things you've heard our panelists say, please continue to add to the chat box any comments. I will, transitioning, because we're about to pause here, I want to make sure that you also know that we have a Q&A button there. Again, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that has a large Q stamped on it, and it says Q&A. That's where you want to submit questions for the entire range of stakeholder representatives with us today. Or it could just be a broad question about equity and civic education, ideally one related to the research findings, the constitutional right, or some of the specific proposals and questions you've heard our featured stakeholder representatives share with us here today. So you have the chat box again for just a comment on what you're hearing. You have the Q&A box at the bottom there if you'd like to pose questions, and you can start doing that not just for Tiffany, but for Hamza and for Leah as well, and ultimately for our final 2 stakeholder representatives. And then we're going to broaden the conversation. I actually have a question for you, and then we're going to try to get to at least a couple of the questions that you submitted through the Q&A box. Again, that we'll be looking at that box to pull questions. So if you've entered them in the chat box before I had a chance to point you to Q&A, please go ahead and it won't be redundant. Go ahead and enter them in the Q&A box. So Tiffany, thank you again for your contributions to the conversation here today. Already, a couple of things jumped out at me. You talked about staffing and how you feel like where you are now, you have a wide range of courses, you have the kind of extracurricular opportunities that many of our young people need and deserve. And you talked about in some of the other schools you've been in, they didn't have the staff capacity. They didn't have enough staff or staff with the right certification or qualifications to be able to provide some of those opportunities. Elective courses in civic learning or clubs. Again, these things take resources, and it's not one thing to say students should have them. It's another thing for schools to receive the resources, but also sort of the policy guidance and structures from our state and from local districts toward encouraging schools to do more of this work and helping them to develop models. As Tiffany mentioned, one of the models she recommended is with schools where you have buildings in which schools share facilities, we call them co-located schools. How can districts or the state ensure that, and that may be very New York City specific in some ways, maybe specific to our large urban districts, what can our states and district do? What kind of policies can they implement toward ensuring that it's easy, not cumbersome to share coursework to the extent that that's appropriate, and to the extent that it truly does provide every single student in those schools, in each of the schools, the opportunities that they need in order to develop these skills and acquire the knowledge to become effective civic participants, to become civic ready. And you talked about also, and this has some policy implications also, you talked about making sure schools are able to visit each other, or staff and students, and maybe parents also from schools are able to see what other schools are doing, to learn from their models, and to really develop relationships toward improving opportunities for students at all of the schools in our state. So I know I've heard other people talk about that. This keeps resurfacing, but I'm glad you introduced it here. You also talked about participatory budgeting, again, hearkening back to what some of Hamza's recommendations and some of the actions he's taken around getting young people, giving them an opportunity to weigh in on what kinds of extracurriculars and courses they would like to see and that they believe they need toward preparing them to be civic ready. Not so that they're choosing between the many things all of which they should have, right? It shouldn't be a false choice, but they should have a wide range of options and have some significant say, should be able to drive some of that decision making. So thank you again, Tiffany, for sharing an educator's perspective here. With that, I'd like to go ahead and turn to, and I do see, thank you everyone. I see you continuing to chat, terrific. Please keep the comments coming in. Again, Cassidy is managing that box. And then I see we have some questions coming in as well, and I'll have a chance to take a look at those to see if they're for specific individuals or maybe broader. But I think we're up to about 6 questions now. Please continue to submit questions, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can in the time we have here today. So with that intermission, I'd like to go ahead and turn to our next featured stakeholder, and that is Ms. Diana Vasquez. And Diana, again, it comes to us as the state coordinator for the Angelo del Toro Puerto Rican Hispanic Youth Leadership Institute, doing some vital, important work outside of the schools and partnerships with schools. And Diana, I'd like to ask you, if I may, some students benefit immensely, we know, from participating in rich, hands-on, experiential civic learning experiences in youth leadership programs beyond their schools, the community setting and otherwise. Many of these programs help young people acquire a real-world understanding of the political process, just to name one example. What can schools, districts, and/or state officials do to ensure that all New York schools are able to offer similarly rich civic learning opportunities so that all of our young people are prepared for active and effective engagement in civic life? Why does that matter? Why does the work you're doing, and that perhaps more schools would do if they had the resources and the guidance, why does that matter for our young people for their civic readiness?
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to share what Pride Light is all about with you. I'm going to give you a little bit of background of our program. The effectiveness of the Angelo del Toro Puerto Rican Hispanic Youth Leadership Institute has been documented effectively for over 30 years of history. This inclusive, cultural responsive, and interdisciplinary training model has empowered young Latino leaders who think strategically and globally. The Puerto Rican Hispanic Youth Leadership framework is extremely effective design for implementation in the wider context of school communities. The core of this design is the collaboration and interaction between students, the facilitators, and the curriculum. This framework can easily be implemented to include content area teachers across curriculum, especially for social science and language arts. Once the teams of facilitators and content area teachers are established, then community building occurs within the classroom. The Pride Light curriculum is easily expanded to include not only issues in government and interest to the Latino school community. The focus can be readily expanded to include various ethnic, civic, and other concerns as well. The skills of focused discussion, questioning, critical thinking, and analysis are indispensable and paramount to all students in classroom across subject areas. Also, Pride Light fosters the ability to think critically about local, state, and global issues that formally consist evidence-based arguments, both verbally and written. These critical thinking skills are then practiced and redefined in discussions and debates in small and larger groups settings. Students have the opportunity to read a wide range of bills and discuss with peers and facilitators regarding the text of these bills and research directly related to them. They also annotate, paraphrase, and formulate sophisticated arguments based upon the bills and research to support the stance or argument. They can and are required to take the role of those who oppose their position in order to look at the bills from all perspectives. They become global thinkers, readers, writers, and civic leaders. The multi-grade and multi-ability dimension of Pride Light is also worth noting. There is a responsibility inherent in Pride Light participation that could be fostered in larger school community with 9th and 10th graders, being mentored by 11th and 12th graders returning students. Learning about the inner working of our government is a way to ensure the future generations are aware of how they can spark changes within the communities, as well as advocate for themselves and others. One way for schools to allow for this same understanding is to have students study the lawmaking process using current, relevant events and bill as examples. Additionally, allowing students to conduct research on current topics of their choice in order to spark professional debates in the classrooms. Creating a hands-on experience rather than textbook-based experience for studying law and lawmaking process is part of what makes Pride Light so successful. Changing and expanding history curriculum is paramount to seeing students to want their voices to be heard. When they learn how their forefathers and ancestors changed their material and social conditions through civic unrest and political and economic action, they learn to do the same as adults.
Great, thank you, Deanna. So a couple of things I heard you say, and again, I see that some of the chats continue to come in. It looks like one thing I just saw, I haven't seen all of your comments. I know Cassidy has, but one thing I noticed there is you're right. I think someone mentioned that the study that we focus on, the Center for Educational Equities research study, does focus primarily on high school. And some of the opportunities you're hearing here are from a high school perspective, but this is a broader conversation. So I think as we think about Deanna's description of PRILI, or the Puerto Rican Hispanic Youth Leadership Institute, we should also be thinking about how do we make sure that our young children, you heard this also from Leah, I believe earlier, how can we make sure that our young children from an early age are fully prepared and have access to not only the text, with Deanna, you mentioned the text not being sufficient, that all of our young people, again, from all ages, need access to experiential hands-on opportunities that I think each featured stakeholder here today has commented on. But a couple of things you really drove home, for me at least, Deanna, how this hands-on experience, this really rich experience with legislators, with the legislative process, prepares the young people you serve to become active civic leaders. You talked about how they actually develop bills, right? They've developed legislative bills, and they get to understand the political process through that lens. You talked also about how they examine issues from multiple perspectives, and that's so critically important. We know in today's sort of fraught political climate, sort of this tense environment we're in, where very rarely do you hear civic leaders, electeds and otherwise, listening to other stakeholders, those who may have opposing views. So what better way, and what more important and an early way to make sure our young people have these opportunities than through the kinds of experiences that PRILI offers and that you propose to us today can be available to students at the school level. And we don't want to create any competitors for PRILI, I'm sure, but I know you would be happy, knowing your mission and your vision, you would be more than happy to see additional schools emulate, right, some of the very rich and excellent practices and opportunities that you're providing there. So thank you again. It's so important that we have a nonprofit partner, someone who's partnering with schools and providing opportunities outside of schools that we can all learn from. So thank you again, Deanna. Certainly, one other thing I want to mention here, let's see, skills practice. Okay, good, we addressed that. So again, please continue to comment, please continue to add questions to Q&A. And we're going to, in just a few moments, get ready after we hear from our next featured stakeholder. We're going to then turn to you, participants, public education stakeholders in New York, and address some of your questions. And also, I have a question for you that I'd love for you to respond to, if you would, in the chat box. And ultimately, in future conversations, this is we have a few folks here who are providing very rich insights, but we hope to, as the Democracy Ready New York Coalition, provide additional opportunities, including in-person opportunities for key stakeholders like yourselves to engage in the conversation, to shape this work, to partner with us, and ultimately to make sure that the ideas are sound and well-informed by everyone who has a vital stake in the civic preparation of our young people, including young people themselves. So with that said, I'd like to go ahead and turn to Jay Verona. Again, Jay is the Deputy Executive Director and General Counsel for the New York State School Boards Association. Also a vitally important perspective. And Jay, I'd like to ask you, schools that serve large numbers of students with extra educational needs, including those who may be struggling academically, and as you know, in certain pockets of our state, we have large percentages of students who are having a hard time meeting state standards, not because they're incapable, but because they need more help. Many of actually, I don't want to repeat the question, well, you could answer that question as well. To provide those additional opportunities, Jay, they have to provide fewer course offerings. They cut field trips, they cut extracurricular opportunities, et cetera, just to make sure that our young people, under the current accountability system, and because young people should have the fundamental skills, are able to meet basic state standards to at least achieve proficiency. Are there ways to avoid some of these trade-offs between sort of the core, the basic curriculum and just trying to scrape, meet basic proficiency standards and these additional opportunities that we know are rich, that are hands-on? Or is it simply inevitable that you got to choose one or the other? If we agree that having a wide range of civic learning opportunities is good for all students, as the research suggests, how do we do that, given all the competing pressures that schools are under, for example, boosting standardized test scores?
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for a great conversation so far. So I would like to hope, on behalf of all the students of the state, that it is not inevitable that we have to have Hobson's choices. I think I'd like to go back to where you began this conversation, which is perhaps not the practical, but it's where we hope to get to, which is the funding of public education. And you talked about the campaign for fiscal equity litigation. There's litigation that is continuing to ensue in the state where individuals are not accepting the state's articulation that the money is the money and that's all there is. So I think what we need to not accept is that funding is necessarily all we're going to get. I know that there are certain things that we can't control, like horrible recessions that are cyclical. But in funding public education, I'd like to say that I think the state needs to consider what resources it actually needs to ensure compliance with the state's educational priorities, particularly those that are constitutionally mandated. In civics education, as you know, the Court of Appeals, our highest court in the state, said was one of those things that was constitutionally mandated. And so if this is a constitutional mandate, I don't think it is acceptable to say that we need to balance things to be able to take other things away that are necessary. So I would start the conversation by not accepting where we are right now. I think we need to keep the state moving in a direction to cost out public education, to place us in a position to see what it really does take. And they have to continue to do that on an ongoing basis, so they don't dip into those periods of time where kids don't get what they need. Now that's where I think the aspirational, where we want to go. But I think practically, I think we perhaps have to continue looking about in embedding civics learning opportunities throughout the P through 12 curriculum, so that students acquire this necessary skill set throughout their entire educational opportunity with us. I think we need to consider mandating civics learning opportunities, but if this is going to be done, I think practically speaking, the state needs to consider what can be eliminated in our present curricular mandates that are either outdated or unnecessary. So we don't just heap another thing on top of what school districts need to provide, because then it's going to be all watered down and we're not going to provide them their opportunities. And finally, I think, and I think Hamza said this beautifully, and I think Tiffany made this point as well. Other people have made this point throughout the discussion, and that students need to have extracurricular activities and their opportunities for them enhanced, because these opportunities are truly the key to ensure that the important skill set of civics is actually becoming integral into the student's educational opportunity. One of the things that I think is very sad, and I think it was Tiffany who said this, that these are important opportunities, but many kids and many school districts throughout the state don't have the opportunity. I'm active in the New York State Bar Association. I know that the Law, Youth, and Citizenship Committee that I am on sponsors the moot court competition. They just had their statewide competition this past week, and I watched some students from Long Island win that competition. And all I could think about was how absolutely sad it is that kids throughout the state don't have those opportunities. The We the People program is another wonderful opportunity to get kids totally engaged in understanding our civics opportunity, civics and our democratic system. And too few schools, are involved in that exercise. And I understand why, but I do see that when kids are engaged in these activities, unlike what they're learning in their textbooks, they're actively engaged. These are learning opportunities that they were never going to forget. And it is very sad to watch how excited these kids are and how proficient they become, and to see that so few of the students in our state actually have these opportunities. It's just unconscionable.
Great, thank you, Jay. A couple important things I want to note here from your remarks, and then we're going to switch over to our engagement with our public stakeholders out there. You said, this is a constitutional obligation. This is a constitutional right. This is the law. And a constitutional right doesn't dissipate in a recession. It doesn't dissipate. It doesn't go away, right, conveniently when we're going through financial hardship. And I think you suggested that the education of our young people, the education of our children, and making sure they're ready to shape and participate in our democracy is fundamental, right? There shouldn't be any trade-offs in that endeavor. We need to uphold that and to fulfill our obligation. You also mentioned that we need the state to figure out which resources are currently available in schools. Where are we? How close are we? And this conversation is about equity and some of the disparities that we noted in our research, and that some of you other folks out in the among other stakeholders are aware of, is that not all schools are able to provide this opportunity. So how can our state elected officials, how can our policymakers assess where we are and then pinpoint, and as you said, I think, cost out, right? How much does it cost to provide these opportunities to all young people in all schools at the appropriate level, at the adequate level, to make sure they're truly ready by the time they graduate? But it doesn't start in high school, as you suggest. It doesn't start when you're about to finish secondary education. It starts much earlier than that. So we need to figure out what are those essential opportunities along the way. We at the Center for Educational Equity have outlined some of them in our report, which you all will receive, but the state really has a responsibility and an opportunity and really an interest and a vision for doing that, I believe, based on their commitment through that College Career and Civic Readiness Index and the Civic Readiness Task Force that they created to explore these and related issues. So thank you, Jay, so much for your contributions. And so with that, thank you, everyone, for your patience. I hope that this background information has been useful to you. I do, as we turn to you, it looks like we have a really good group here today. I'd love to hear a little bit about, or actually see where you're from. And I didn't trigger this poll. We have these snap polls that we can do through this webinar platform. So I'd like to go ahead and quickly trigger, before we get to your questions, at least one of these polls here to find out who's currently participating in the webinar to better understand where you're coming from and which perspectives you share. So let's see if I can do this correctly and efficiently. I'm going to go ahead and launch this first poll. And the poll says, which of the following stakeholder groups do you most identify with? And I know this is going to be difficult for some of you because you're a student and a teacher, you're a parent and a school administrator, what have you. But if you could choose the one that you most identify with, just for today's conversation. So I'm going to launch that poll and then give you a few seconds to, if you would, you should see a field pop up. I see, okay, great. The responses are coming in already. It looks like you've done this before. Wow, this is exciting. All right, so let's see which groups you most identify with for the purposes of today's conversation. Okay. It looks like, okay, give you a few more seconds here for you all to maybe to chime in here. It looks like, one of the things I'm noticing here is, several of our featured stakeholders said that students need to be at the table, need to be involved in these decision-making. Of course, Hamza is here, but it would be great to see more young people involved in this particular conversation. And I think what we may need to do is have probably a youth-specific webinar. We'll invite other stakeholders, but really have one that's centered on youth involvement in this policy-related, research-related equity work. So looks like we have a lot of nonprofit folks here. For not everyone has had a chance to vote, that's okay. But of those who did vote, a lot of nonprofit people. We also have a few teachers, a few educators, a couple parents, some college faculty members, and otherwise, a couple school board members I see. So thank you all. And this is helpful for us as we look to plan additional opportunities and figure out how we can best target and tailor the webinars and other opportunities to different stakeholders. So looks like we have some work to do there, but thank you all for participating. So let me go ahead and close that poll out here. And then one more poll before we turn to your questions here. Let's see, we'll end that poll. Let's see if we can do this, share results. How do we launch the next poll? We're gonna go here to the caret and then we're gonna select this. Okay, everyone's learning here today. And that actually is a good segue to our next question, which you should be able to see now in a moment. Let's see. You should see it now. How familiar were you, speaking of learning, with New York students' constitutional right to civic preparation before this conversation? Right? We talked about it a little bit at the very beginning of the conversation. You've heard some of our stakeholders today here refer to the lawsuit, the constitutional right, and what it guarantees in terms of civic preparation. Let's see where you're coming from and what level of understanding you may have had before you joined us here today. So we still have a couple more seconds here. People who haven't had a chance to weigh in. Okay, let's give you about 5 more seconds. Again, how familiar were you with this constitutional right that all New York students have to be prepared for civic participation before this conversation? All right, so let's go ahead. I'm going to end the poll now. It looks like we have, and I'm going to, let's see, I'll share it with you so you can see. I think I could share if we share results here. You should be able to see, again, not everyone who's on. Looks like we have close to 60 people who are participating in the webinar, but of the folks who did participate in the poll, you can see there's a decent spread there. But a large majority of you either didn't know much about the right or you hadn't heard of the right. It's brand new to you, so that's good. And that's why we're providing this conversation as the DemocracyReady New York Coalition to raise awareness per our mission and to engage additional stakeholders. So let me stop that there. Okay, and we will close that poll out. So thank you for participating. Okay, so we do have a few minutes left. Why don't we go ahead and turn to the questions here. I'm going to turn to the Q&A box here and see what we have here. Again, we're not going to be able to, I apologize, get to all of the questions, but let's see what we have here. All right, let me move this up. All right, so it looks like Claire, Claire is the other technical support person from the Office of Instructional Support here at Teachers College, and she's also teaming up with Cassidy to field some of your questions and make sure we see them here. I see one here near the beginning, Claire documented. How do we best respond and support schools and educators? And I guess I'm gonna paraphrase that a little bit. Hopefully I get to the heart of the question that I believe someone had posed in the chat box and we transferred over. So, and I want to target this specifically to maybe Tiffany, for example, but really any of our student panelists, anyone here is qualified and equipped to answer this question. What do you need? Let me simplify this. We've heard some elements that you think are essential, some of the things that need to be available. What do you think we can do? And I'll let if I can frame that a little bit, what can sort of the state do? And then what can the DemocracyReady New York Coalition do to make sure that schools and educators are supported to provide the civic readiness opportunities to our young people? Is there anything else? Again, we have touched on that, I know. Is there anything else that, because we've gone through the entire range of stakeholders, that maybe you were in the beginning that you'd like to comment on in terms of how we can best support schools and educators? Tiffany.
So I've been in the chats and looking at the questions and kind of like seeing what the conversation is. And I am a member of the UFT-AFT Civics Working Group. So we're in the midst right now of like 50 educators all the way from K to 12. We have many elementary school educators, many middle school educators talking about what civics looks like. So the idea here is that civics is not only something that is translatable to the social studies classroom, but to every classroom and outside of the classroom in all schools. A couple of things that I think that we can really do to support schools, regardless as to the school's budget, is of course to have partnership with nonprofits like Deanna's organization and other organizations. I think they're really key to making sure students understand and have an education that's culturally relevant to them. And a lot of our kids are screaming out for some cultural relevance. They're not seeing it. It's not in our history curriculum. And most recently in high school, the history curriculum has kind of been whittled down into European history. So everything else doesn't really exist for the kids. And you have to see yourself in history in order to understand that you can also be a stakeholder and that you can change things, as Deanna said. I think it's important also to have key partnerships with organizations that are willing to help. Mentorship with the outside community. We have plenty of people in our communities who are vetted and or can be vetted and willing to help and introduce students into different fields of study, different ways to organize, etc. We're not taking advantage of this right now. Right now, schools exist in a bubble. They're just in the communities, many of them, but they're not really intricate parts of the community. There's not this tight bond. We've kind of moved away from community schooling, where students, especially in New York City, per se, probably not in Leah's district, but in our district, students come from all over the city to go to the schools, and so we don't necessarily have this local connection, and we need to make those local connections stronger. And I also think that schools creating internship opportunities for students, I think that is key. That was one of the things that changed my life. My very first internship came through my experience at Benjamin Cardozo High School in Queens, where I interned in the Queens District Attorney's Office for the summer. And that was my first experience to see how the District Attorney's Office works and what was happening there and to determine whether or not I did want to pursue the field of law or education or what really matters. And I don't think our students see enough.
How did you find that internship, Tiffany, if I may ask? Was that a school-based connection that was made where other students, was it required, was it part of the school program to help connect these dots to provide internships, or was it something that you happened upon sort of outside of the school?
Well, it was definitely a school organization, and I was part of a program called the Public Service Program, and so they kind of courted students in the 9th grade to say, hey, do you want to be a part of this? If you're interested in law or anything in the public service, this might be interesting to you. And we took a bunch of classes, and we went to things this was way back in the 90s. We personally advocated for different things. We visited wards of AIDS patients. We looked at some of the issues that were most closely affecting our communities and our school at that particular time. And then we had several English classes and social studies classes that focused around this civic type of education. And at the end of the 11th grade year, we were all taught to interview, and they had various partnerships with different areas, different organizations in the city. I don't know if that program still exists, but they had a partnership with the Department of Corrections, with the District Attorney's Office. There were so many different things. All the students did something different. And
I want to turn, if I can, just for a minute, Tiffany, because you've given us a lot to chew on there. I just want to make sure that I'd like to hear from Hamza or Leah, I think, for this specific question, sort of building on what Tiffany was describing, that amazing hands-on learning opportunity that she had that taught her about the law and about government through that program. We heard from the two of you, there are certain things that schools can do to better support students, and each of you emphasized the experiential, right, that hands-on practicing civic skills. Are there things that either that your schools have or that they don't have that you think are essential? I'm thinking, Leah was talking about, or I was asking her about staffing, right? Is there a person at the school who's responsible for connecting all young people with, whether it's in the school or outside of the school, some kind of civic learning internship or project-based opportunity? Because I know that takes a lot of work and time and energy. And if you're not set up to do that, it can be very difficult. So Leah or Hamza, for this particular question, is there anything that in terms of staffing or other supports that schools need in order to provide those kinds of external project-based opportunities beyond what you've shared, perhaps?
Yes, specifically in my school, for me, it started with our few clubs, and you make contact with teachers there, and they provide you with internships or opportunities that are available in our community. But that's just specific teachers that dedicate their time to that. But now our schools have realized how much those opportunities have benefited students like me and a lot of other students, and our school is working on this thing where it's sort of like a career fair, but like a community fair where a lot of businesses and local politicians and a lot of firms, they're coming into our school over the summer, and they're gonna see how they can provide opportunities for the students to have internships, work for them, and in whatever way they can involve the students. And our school has over 100 community people or businesses coming in, and it's just our district's moving in the right direction, and that starts from the school, and they have to reach out to these opportunities because they're definitely out there in most communities, and the school has to reach out to them and make them available for schools and communities. The businesses, they want the students to also get these skills by working with them, because they want better workers for them as students come into the workforce, and they want students to be able to be prepared with those skills.
That's really good. You're connecting the dots, Hamza. As you mentioned, remember from the very beginning of the presentation when we're outlining the constitutional rights, there's those two buckets, right? Preparation for civic participation and preparation for essentially a good job or competitive employment. You just connected those two dots here between some of the skills that employers are looking for are similar or overlap with some of the skills that are important, essential to participate in and shape our democracy. 100 businesses or 100 organizations, who does that work in the school? Is there a specific person, or is there a team?
Yes.
Or is it just sort of catch as catch can? Whoever has some free time, they can fill in.
Well, our school has been doing this program. It's like a strategic planning committee that specifically has worked for months and has built plans and everything for how to make our school ready for 21st century learning. And this is a subcommittee of that big committee, and our superintendent is leading it. And there's different stakeholders and parents, teachers, and I'm one of the only students in those committees, but they reach out to whatever opportunity they see available, and it's our superintendents leading the way, really. Leading the way, and it involves a wide range of people who are giving their time. Yes. So it's a question of how do we make sure that all schools, all districts are able to do that. So that's something worth. I think we can learn a lot from you. I think each of these. I wish we had a full hour really to delve into some of the opportunities and questions that each of our featured stakeholders have raised, because it's so important and rich. But we'll have to do more webinars. How's that? Absolutely. Daily webinars this summer? Anyone? Yeah. Okay. So again, I want to open it up for Leah. Did you also have something to comment? Thank you, Hamza.
No, I was just going to say that we do similar things in our district as children age up, but sitting here and being a part of this has made me realize I know it's not something all schools do anymore, but our school district, they have character development. They have they have school-wide assemblies, and I think it could be easy if your school already does that. Sometimes I think it's hard as a parent. You like the idea of something and you want to add it, and you ask if it can be added, but the schools do so much that they have to do. But then it might be just asking the question, could one of those school assemblies that you do for the lower grades be focused more on some of these soft skills, job opportunities, things like that? So that you can just plug into something that already exists rather than adding on to the things that teachers are busy, volunteers are hard to find, stuff like that. But a community member or some of the parents might be able to float 20 minutes to do an assembly presentation about the job they do, or do demonstrations on some of those soft skills, because I think the more you practice at a young age, the better you're going to be when you get to the place where that's already plugged into mentorships and internships. I think those are hugely important. Again, it's using your people as resources and not costing more money.
Right, yeah. So it's always going to be a balance. What can you do with what you have? And then to the extent that you need additional resources, how do you go about identifying what you need and then securing it from, whether it's a state, districts, or local communities? Thank you for adding that perspective. I want to also ask, and this is another question here, I think from in the Q&A box here that someone asked about, and Jay and Deanna, I'm thinking about you two because for two different reasons. The question is, and I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, not all young people are extroverts. Not all young people are sort of going to be the ones who are going to go out there and petition, or going to collect information from the community, or, advocate for an issue they're concerned about, or even just gather information, go around and talking to local community members to better understand challenges and potential solutions. How do we help our young people who maybe aren't as savvy, who aren't as maybe disposed to, or don't feel as comfortable actively engaging in some of these more outward and public initiatives and projects? Is there a way for us, a way that schools can differentiate or really tailor these kinds of opportunities to different types of students, particularly with a lens toward social and emotional wellness and personality differences? Because we know that, just like we've heard here, at some projects that may work for a rural community or rural school district for preparing young people for civic readiness may be different in some ways, in some cases, from those in a really urban context or suburban context. So do you have any insights, or based on whether it's the opportunities that PRILI provides, or Jay from bird's eye view as a school board's representative, how can schools make sure that they're meeting the needs within schools, even of different types of children who have different types of needs? Either how do you do it, or how have you seen, or maybe you've, based on some of the experiences or research or some of your work in the field, how do you cater to those individualized, personalized needs, recognizing that young people access this work, this learning in different ways?
It comes to my mind that we have Hispanic students in our program that just arrived. Their English is very limited. They get help from the ENL teachers, and they are very close to us, to the program, because they recommend students to us. So these students are very shy at first. They can start the program in 9th grade, and they just, get a sense of what the program is about. They come up for the trainings, usually they're Saturdays or after school, and they start learning about the program and what we can do as a whole, as a community, right? And by the end of the trainings, that usually they start in November and go through March, they have, become better at their public speaking. And then imagine them, if they start in 9th grade, when they are seniors, oh my God, you should see them in the mock assembly, debating for these bills, taking a stand, making their voice to be heard. So it's a process that takes time, but we give them the tools. We work with them through the trainings, the trainers, and some of the students that come back as volunteers. We really work close to them. So it's like a little group here at the trainings, and when we all get together in this PRILI Institute in March, this year we had 255 students from across the state. We were all there at the assembly, and they met people and assemblymen and congressmen. They were all there, senators, and they were very impacted. So it's like, starting as little and ending as big.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's really important that you bring that perspective, and you talk English language learners and English for folks who are new to the language, and in some cases I think you mentioned new to the country as well. And you said you sort of start small, right? You provide those supports. Their schools select them knowing that they'll be supported, and they're supported throughout the process and participating. And by the end of the process, or as they progress, they become more confident. They find their voice, not only in terms of their English language skills, but it sounds like also in terms of their ability to participate as a civic participant. And that's really important to note, is that the constitutional right isn't only guaranteeing these opportunities to students who, grew up in the United States from an early age. This constitutional right applies to all of our young people in every school. If they're in a New York school, they have a right to be prepared for civic participation, and we can't stress that enough. So thank you for that example from PRILI. Jay, I'm going to target a sort of a different question to you, if I may, and that is regarding, you talked earlier about mandates, and I see one of the questions in the question box here pertains to, they say, you know, it's great to increase opportunities for community participation, but there's no guarantee in that. And what I think this commenter or inquirer was getting at is, it looks like there's some language about accountability. How do we make sure? I mean, you're school boards. I know school boards often aren't fond of mandates. And you mentioned if you're going to add something, require our districts to do certain things, our school boards to do certain things, you got to help us figure out what we might have to reduce or shift a little bit or do differently. Talk to us for a moment, if you would, about accountability and how at the state level, how can the state implement an accountability system for civic learning that it accomplishes the goal of making sure all students are civic ready, but that doesn't get into some of the sort of avoid some of the snafus, some of the challenges that may be unnecessary in the process. What does the ideal accountability system for this look like for you?
Well, I mean, to start with, I think, Joe, accountability, you know, would be best determined by the local school districts. I mean, if they're not doing their job, then perhaps the state needs to step in. But I wouldn't presuppose that, you know, a local district would not be able, if they had the right resources, right, would not be able to make appropriate determinations as to whether they have accomplished their goal of getting these kids proficient in civics learning, right? So I think the local districts would be able to make that determination. But again, back to what I said before, that all becomes impossible if the resources aren't there to provide the opportunity to start with. So, you know, obviously, I would leave up to the educators who are on this webinar the best way to make those opportunities available. But the opportunity has to start with money and resources to be able to make sure educators can go off and do what they need to do.
Right, and it starts with really the value, right? Making that priority. And we always find money to fund our priorities, right? So
right, and I think what we need to do, and I think everyone on this webinar would agree, hopefully, that when you define the word our, it's not just the school district, it's societal, right? This is an important aspect of what kids need to be able to achieve in order to be productive citizens for all of us, because they're going to leave school at some point. So this is not just about what schools want. And I think that's what the state misunderstands. They think we're money grubbers. We want just more resources. No, we want to make sure that our kids are able to be as productive as they possibly can. That really is what this is all about.
You heard it here first. It's really about the young people. One little wrinkle, and then we're going to have to close. It's such a rich, again, I'd love to be able to extend the conversation, but we are almost at our witching hour. We're almost at 5 o'clock. So just a quick question again, Jay, has school boards done any work, a survey or any research to find out to the extent to which these opportunities are already being provided and what the barriers are? Have you all published any reports? And of course, with the Center for Educational Equity, we do some of this research, so we hope this informs the work, and we'd certainly like to expand it. But has school boards done any studies or surveys to understand from its members, how we're doing in preparing young people?
We haven't done that yet, Joe, and you're making me feel guilty because we need to, and we need to work along with you and the researchers who have all of this stuff at their fingertips. What we have done is we've attempted to work with school districts with respect to the opportunities that are out there, but unfortunately, to acquire those opportunities like core competitions, et cetera, it requires districts to have the resources to be able to provide those opportunities.
Okay, good. Thanks, Jay. And then just finally, I just want to make sure we underscore here, this is a constitutional responsibility that is really, it's incumbent upon, it's a responsibility of our state government to make sure that these all young people have access to a sufficient, adequate level of civic learning opportunities. So, school boards, educators, teachers, students, our nonprofit partners, youth development specialists, superintendents, parents, and other sort of stakeholders all have a role to play. But that constitutional responsibility is really the responsibility of our state government. That includes our state policymakers, that includes the legislature, it includes the governor. And collectively, we have to make sure that we're all doing our parts. And we'll come back to this issue of accountability and figure out what it looks like, not to chastise and punish folks, but really to make sure that we're tracking, we're monitoring access to these opportunities, and ultimately they're being delivered to all students per the state constitution. I want to thank, as we close, our panelists again for their phenomenal contributions here, for enlightening us and raising questions here. Please join me, everyone. I know we can't hear you, but join me in thanking anyway, Jay Warona, Diana Vasquez, Leah Antwala, Hamza Noor, and Tiffany Allen Hubbard. Thank you so much for taking your time to inform the discussion and inform the decision making. In terms of next steps, all the folks who registered for this session will receive, you supplied your email address, so we're going to send you a copy of that report, and as well as a shorter executive summary that we hope you'll be able to use as a tool to look more closely at what your schools and districts, communities are providing against what we actually need to fulfill this obligation. And then you should also know that the report at the very end, that very 50-page report, will include the questions that we asked at the school level when we conducted the research. So there's certainly questions that you may want to adapt and use to do your own inventory, to do your own assessment of what opportunities are available in your schools or your districts. And perhaps the state or state policymakers who are on may want to take a look as well, and we look forward to partnering with them toward realizing this obligation. So thank you, everyone. I just wanted to ask you, there'll be a 45-second survey that will pop up on your screen as soon as we conclude momentarily. I ask you to just give us a minute to give us your feedback so that we can make sure that future opportunities are useful to you and informative and hopefully inspiring as you look to take action in collaboration with the Democracy Ready New York Coalition. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy, and we look forward to partnering with you.